speaking of which, the the EU has this issue with Hungary. They fined Hungary for 200 million, I think, euro or dollar or something, for Hungary to refuse to take illegal immigrants, right?
Yeah.
Well, Sweden is now giving $34,000 to immigrants so that they can go back. I feel like well, then it kind of like what Sweden is doing, it's kind of like explain why Hungary is doing what it's doing, because Hungary doesn't want to get into a situation where Sweden is, that you have to pay people to leave, right? So it's fully understandable. But the EU had got into this fight with Hungary because Hungary refused to pay the fine, and now they're taking money out of Hungary's EU fund or something, like force them to pay.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Why do they so obsessed with punishing Hungary like this, where you can see Sweden has this problem, right?
Well, indeed, and Germany has now also imposed border controls to stop immigrants. This has been done by Chancellor Scholz, and nobody's talking about seizing German funds or anything, or fining Germany in that way. You're absolutely correct. They're obsessed with Hungary. They're obsessed with Viktor Orban. There's all kinds of reasons why. They perceive him as pro-Russian when he's pursuing Hungarian national interests. And has a different perspective, an accurate perspective on the Ukraine war. They don't like him because he's a Christian, and there's a very strong anti-Christian movement in Europe at the moment, which I don't understand and can't get my head around in the slightest, but it does exist. I find it very odd. They don't like him because he goes against the demands of the EU Centre on law reforms and things of that kind. Essentially, what they don't like about Orban is that he is a sovereigntist who sees his role as representing Hungary and defending the interests of its people. Now, you might always agree with his perspectives. You might think that perhaps he's wrong in some of the positions that he's taking. Whereas the very fact that he sees himself as representing Hungary rather than being a loyal servant of the centre in Brussels, that I think is what makes them angry. The government in Sweden can do what it likes, but it is 110% loyal to the EU centre. The Germans, of course, are in a completely different category again. But Orban, precisely because he asserts himself and leads a country which aspires to a degree of independence, that is unacceptable.
Don't you think that EU, my observation is they do, like big countries suppress the smaller ones. So don't you think they do that? I feel that's what they're doing.
Oh, this is no question about it. There is there's a layered structure within the EU. The Germans are at the top, the French are just below them, Italy and Spain then follow. Then too, but those are the countries, the big countries that really matter. There's some other very important and privileged ones: the Netherlands, Sweden, Poland to some extent, though less so. But it's absolutely not the case that all countries in the EU are equal. Some are a lot more equal than others, to quote Orwell.
Well, it's a little bit surprising because I remember when there was a referendum in Sweden to join the EU. I mean, at the time, there were a lot of Swedish who was very skeptical about it because they are afraid that, it become a big country dominant the small ones. So I thought in the beginning, they were very careful of not to making the smaller countries feel that way, but they don't care anymore, it seems like. That's the way it is.
No, they don't, because what eventually happens is if you join the EU, because so much power has left the states and has trickled to the centre, that politicians in the states, in order to get things done, now increasingly have to look to the centre rather than to their own people. And because it's at the centre that so many decisions are made. And that has gradually changed their relationship, both with the centre and with their people. They're more distant from their people than they were. and they're more loyal to the center than they used to be. So it's having that effect. It means that EU states, the leaders of EU states, think of themselves increasingly as more as EU people, as part of an EU project, than they do as Swedes or French or Germans or whatever, at least some of them.
A question about this immigration in general, because it's a problem here in the United States too, and EU. Why would the EU, for example, think it's a good idea to take in whatever the refugees and illegal immigrants, and why is that they are so open about this? You see, this is different in China. China really have very strict immigration policies.
Yeah.
Part of it is because China is already have a big population, so they don't feel the need for immigrants. But also, China also have historically, understand that when you have very different people coming into, it sometimes create frictions and troubles if they don't quickly absorbed by the society, which can be hard sometimes, in particular if you have a bad economy, you don't have job for everybody, and they don't speak the language. I observe that. I see that in Sweden. It's hard for people to totally being absorbed into the Swedish society if you don't speak Swedish, for example. Many of them don't. It's a totally different language, although, it's not impossible to learn, but it is a different language. And so it's hard for them to totally mix within with the society. So they have their own places, and those places, many of them do have problems, because of the high unemployment, etc. With all that, how come both EU seems you have to take in those immigrants, and the US, of course, has its border problems? Why is that?
Well, I think there's a mixture of political, economic, and ideological things. If we're talking about the EU specifically, I'm going to talk mainly about the EU because it's what I'm familiar with. It's important to understand that it considers it is a supranational institution. It therefore is very mistrustful by definition of assertions of nationalism. And that means that it doesn't have that sense of belonging to a nation that, say, the Chinese government does. The Chinese government perceives itself as the government of the Chinese people and is there to look after their interests. And it doesn't want to be in a situation where the Chinese people are swamped by other people, because they're no longer the Chinese people. So just as the Chinese themselves, they want their government to be there for them. I mean, it's not, by the way, what we're saying is historically uncontroversial in many countries. If we're looking at the very first democracy, which was ancient Athens, which of course I know all about because I was born there. I was born in Athens. The ancient Athens had extremely strict immigration policies. I mean, it never gave out its citizenship except in very particular cases as a special honor, because it was felt that if the privilege of citizenship were extended too lightly, then that would dilute the power of the sovereign people in the exercise of their own democracy. So just to say, so what we're saying is completely uncontroversial, but the European Union is a completely different category because it doesn't have that connection with any single nation. And it is deeply hostile, ultimately, to expressions of nationalism or of national identity. So already it's going to be less hostile to immigration than a national government might be expected to be. So that's the first thing. The second is that the whole point about the EU is freedom of movement within the Union. And I mean, without that, the whole system starts to break down. And for that reason, again, they don't really like any step that restricts movement, because that seems to undermine the integrity of the entire project. That's the second thing. And the third thing is, of course, they also have an economic logic behind this, because the EU economy is in a very stagnant situation. Productivity is very low, and there is a perception, I think it's also true in Britain and in the United States, that if you want to keep economic activity going, and if you want to increase your GDP, you do that by importing people. And that, if it does nothing else, it increases the GDP. And I think this is a factor which is very underestimated, by the way. I think that maintaining high rates of GDP so that you can pretend to yourself that you're keeping up with China in particular is so important, that if you do that simply by importing people, or letting people come in and then paying them welfare payments, which, by the way, will increase the GDP, that is sufficient in itself to justify doing it.
They're obsessed with China, isn't it? Everything.
Oh, they are. I think people in China underestimate the extent to which they are. It's a very dangerous obsession, but they are absolutely obsessed with China. Both the Americans and the Europeans are. As I said, the idea that an East Asian country has risen to this level absolutely drives them wild. I mean, they can't get their heads around it at all. They don't really want to, relate to it or try to understand it, because, it's something else. It's not part of the Western family. So they have to find some way to surpass it, to reduce it, to isolate it, to cut it off. And that's why we're seeing all the tensions in the world that we are.
Yeah, and in terms of in the US, I have to say it's always very puzzling to me. Okay, I myself is an immigrant, so of course I don't against the people immigrant to one place from one place to another. But I thought you need to do it orderly, right? You need to come here legally with a visa for a purpose. Yes. But right now it's like, oh, everyone can just come in, and I mean it's called illegal immigrant for a reason, right? It is illegal. But in particular, the Democrat, it seems like you can't even use the word illegal. I mean, it is illegal, and they didn't get any permission to come in, but no, you can't say it's illegal. And then once these people coming in, they got deprived of all kinds of, I mean, they're being abused. They are not paid properly. They certainly don't have health care or any protection. So they are not having a good life here, but nobody cares. We just want them in.
Yeah.
Creating all kinds of problems.
It creates huge problems. And again, of course, contrary to what many people think, it is actually contrary to American policy, at least after about 1920. I mean, when the US had, as I very well remember, very strict immigration controls indeed. In the heyday of its power and prosperity and wealth, that was again taken for granted. Not anymore, it would seem.
Yeah.
But I want to stress again your point about the obsession with China. It's important. Not people in China, I don't think, understand the extent to which it is there, and certainly goosing up the GDP figures, which we do all the time, in order to make it look as if our growth rate is somehow similar to China's, is very much a priority for some people.
Yeah. And we talked about this, that GDP itself is a pretty flawed way of calculating things, right?
Absolutely.
And just so you know, that actually China is perfectly happy to have United States to be the most powerful country. China is okay with that, actually. Yeah. That's not a priority for China because China doesn't want to be the target. Once you are at the top, the very top, then you will be the target. One way or another, you will be. So China is actually okay. If you want to be the most powerful, fine. Just leave us alone. That's all China wants.
China is not obsessed with the US. The US, unfortunately, is obsessed with China. That's the problem.